Welcome to this second of a series of videos. This one explains one simple and fairly quick way to do a task analysis. A task analysis is a critical step necessary on the way to developing a structured on-job training program or any training event for that matter. There are many methods for conducting a task analysis, but this video addresses only one. The method goes by several names. The one we will use is called nominal group. The method uses 3 to 5 subject matter experts plus a supervisor in a highly structured brainstorming workshop environment to glean the information. The subject matter experts are people who the company has judged to meet or exceed requirements of the job to be analyzed. The supervisor is there not to provide input, but to prevent identification of tasks that are not really a part of the job. The workshop is normally held in a conference-type room. It can also be done remotely by Zoom, but that's the subject of another video. I'll jump right into the room setup and attendees. This rectangle represents the room. At the front, it should have a whiteboard or chalkboard on which to write. I also recommend having a flip chart pad with sheets on which to write. I suggest having the tables set up so that the people seated at each one can see everyone else. The subject matter experts will be seated at these tables. The supervisor can be seated behind the subject matter experts. And, of course, the leader stands and works from the front of the room. It is essential that during the 1 to 3 day workshop that the subject matter experts not be interrupted. Interruptions can break trains of thought and compromise the accuracy of the task analysis. Next, let's look at the supplies that you'll need. You'll need several manila folders. They don't have to be colored. Next, you're going to need a quantity of plain paper. Paper with lines might work better. Next, you're going to need markers for the whiteboard. All black will work fine. You're going to need some tape, and masking tape works fine for that purpose. And last, you're going to need a stapler. After introductions and welcoming to the workshop, the leader will move to the flip chart and quickly record the list of things that a person does throughout the day. That discussion starts with, tell me the first thing you do when you arrive in the morning or at the beginning of the shift. Well, what do you do next? And the questions go on with the results noted on the flip chart pages. The leader must also ask if there are things done on a periodic basis and record those also. The list may involve a single sheet of paper or it could take several. Once this discussion is ended, the leader sets the flip chart aside. It will not be used until much later in the workshop. The next step is to define, for use in this workshop, the word consensus. This is vitally important because from this point on, all recorded input must represent group consensus. For this group, the definition of consensus is when no one has an issue with a group decision that they cannot live with. Discuss this as necessary until you have 100% buy-in. The next things to be addressed in the workshop are the areas of responsibilities or duties. Ask the participants to define their areas of responsibility and write these on the whiteboard as they're mentioned. Check each statement for consensus and revise it as necessary. When all have agreed, write each of the duties on the outside of a manila folder. Then tape those manila folders to the whiteboard and make a last-minute check for consensus. Here's how the whiteboard might appear at this point. The next thing to be done is to sequence the duties. It is important that the SMEs decide the strategy for the sequence as well as the sequence itself. Once again, it is important that the decisions be the result of consensus. When the sequencing operation is done, here's how the whiteboard might look. Keep the folders as high on the whiteboard as you can comfortably reach. The next step will be to define the task for each duty. But first, there must be a clear understanding of what a task is. There are several attributes of a task. First, it is a trainable chunk of work for which an employer is willing to pay. It has an identifiable beginning and end. It involves several elements which could be steps or subtasks. A task results in an identifiable product, service, or decision. It can be performed over a relatively short period of time. It can be performed independently of other work. And last, but certainly not least, it can be observed and measured. As a suggestion, I recommend that the definition of a task be distributed to the attendees in a handout. Once the term task has been defined, the next step will be to define the criteria for a task statement. A task statement must describe an activity with definite beginning and end points. It can be performed over a relatively short period of time. It is performed independently of other work. It consists of 2 or more steps. It can be observed and measured. It results in a product, service, or decision. It contains an action verb plus an object that receives that action. It may contain relevant modifiers, but avoid the terms like effectively and efficiently. Each task statement must be explicit, precise, and stand alone. Task statements must avoid reference to knowledge, skills, abilities, and attitudes. They must avoid references to tools or equipment that merely support performance. All of these items must be taken into consideration when coming up with task statements. I suggest including these items in handouts. Now that you've established the criteria for a task statement, the next step is to start with Duty 1 and define all of the applicable tasks. Be sure that all task statements have subject matter expert consensus. Compare each task statement to the list of descriptors, and then write the statement on the whiteboard and go for another. When the subject matter experts agree that all tasks have been defined for Duty 1, transfer all tasks to 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper and tape the sheets to the whiteboard. Here's how that whiteboard might look. The next step will be to sequence the task, number them, and put them in order under the duty. Here again, the subject matter experts should agree on the logic of the sequence and the order itself. Here's how the whiteboard might look. Continue the process until all tasks have been defined and sequenced for all duties. At this point, all duties and tasks have been defined, and it's time to identify the standards of performance for each task. But first, it is important to establish the format for the statements. And here's the rule. Standard statements are words that complete the sentence, I will know that this task has been satisfactorily completed when I can observe that. Be sure that everyone is aware that there is no set number of performance standard statements for a task. Some may have only one, while another might have several. The next step is to go through all of the tasks and define the standards of performance. Write these down on the sheets with the task statements. When the standards of performance for all tasks have been identified and documented, the next step will be to identify and document for each task ratings for difficulty, frequency, probability of error without training, and consequence of error. These values will serve as guides in determining such things as: is training really required? Are job aids recommended? Is refresh training to be recommended? All of this information should go on the same sheet as the task. If more sheets are necessary, be sure to staple all of them together. Here are 5 choices for difficulty: extremely difficult, very difficult, moderately difficult, somewhat easy, and very easy. For frequency, more frequently than once per week, once every 2 or 3 weeks, once every 3 weeks to 4 months, once every 5 to 12 months, and less than once per year. For probability of error without training, extremely likely, likely, moderately likely, possible, and not likely at all. For consequence of error, extremely severe, severe, serious, undesirable, and negligible. After these 4 areas have been addressed, determine and document if there are any task-specific safety issues or hazards. Make a note whether or not any prerequisite training is needed. In other words, are there things that the new employee must know or be able to do before starting on the production floor? And, if necessary, record any notes that might apply to the task. At this point, you have a manila folder for each duty and 1 or more sheets of paper stapled together for each task. Now you can go back to the flip chart you created at the very beginning of the workshop and cross off all of the items for which you know you have a defined task. If you wind up with an item on the flip chart that is not crossed off, you must go back to define the missing task or tasks. Now you can declare the workshop complete. But hold on. There are 2 more things to be done. The task analysis document itself has to be created and then reviewed and approved with the stakeholders. For the task analysis document, you're on your own. But for the approval process, I recommend getting the original crew plus the stakeholders back in that same room with everyone having a copy of the task analysis document. Then go through the document item by item, making any revisions required in your master document. When that is done, you have completed the process and have a document that can guide development of courses, including structured on-job training to support getting a new employee up to speed. Thanks for watching.